It all began with something so simple, so innocent, that most people wouldn't have given it a second thought. A flower pot. Not just any flower pot, though. It was a hand-painted ceramic planter, resting proudly at the corner of a quiet suburban home. Bright petunias and marigolds spilled over the sides, giving life and color to an otherwise dull HOA-mandated beige neighborhood. The homeowner, a woman who had poured her love and time into maintaining the property, had placed it there as a small act of personal expression. To her, the pot wasn't just decoration, it was a statement that her home was hers, a place of individuality in a community that often felt suffocating under endless rules. But to the HOA board, particularly one notoriously overzealous board president, that pot was an unauthorized structure. The complaint came swiftly, tucked into her mailbox like a slap in the face. The letter listed the violation in cold, bureaucratic language, stating that the pot obstructed community uniformity and violated the landscaping code. The irony? The pot wasn't blocking anything. It wasn't an eyesore. It was beautiful. But in the HOA's eyes, it was rebellion. The first fine was small, $50. Annoying, yes, but something she might have brushed off. Still, she knew if she paid it, she would be admitting guilt, and in her mind, she had done nothing wrong. So, she refused. The next fine came, doubled. Then tripled. Within weeks, the HOA had stacked thousands of dollars in penalties over a single flower pot. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. Some supported her quiet defiance, while others avoided eye contact, afraid of drawing the board's attention. The HOA meetings grew tense. The president lectured about community standards and keeping property values intact. But the homeowner's quiet resolve only seemed to fuel his obsession. Soon, the situation escalated into something far more aggressive than anyone thought possible. A notice arrived that shocked everyone. If the pot wasn't removed, the HOA would exercise its right to correct the violation by force. At first, the homeowner laughed, assuming it was just more intimidation. After all, who would go to extremes over a ceramic pot filled with flowers? But when she saw a construction crew surveying the property lines, tape measure in hand, her heart sank. The HOA wasn't bluffing. They were planning to bring in heavy equipment. For a flower pot. That's when she realized this wasn't just about one small decoration anymore. This was about power. It was about control. And if she didn't fight back, the HOA would win, not just against her, but against every homeowner who dared to express themselves. And so, she prepared for a battle that no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. A battle that would begin with the rumble of machinery and end with the entire internet watching. The bulldozer was coming, the morning was unusually still, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The homeowner woke to the low growl of diesel engines, and when she pulled back her curtains, she saw it, a yellow bulldozer parked across the street, its blade gleaming under the morning sun. Alongside it stood a small crew of workers, orange vests glowing like warning signs against the dull row of cookie-cutter houses. Word spread quickly. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, coffee mugs in hand, whispering to one another in disbelief. Some shook their heads, muttering about the HOA finally going too far. Others watched with guilty curiosity, secretly glad it wasn't them under fire this time. The homeowner stood on her lawn, staring at the absurdity of it all. A bulldozer. For a single flower pot. She felt a mix of anger, humiliation, and determination swirl inside her chest. The board president wasn't just enforcing rules anymore, he was staging a public spectacle, a warning to anyone else who might dare challenge his authority. The crew hesitated at first, unsure of how to proceed. The flower pot, after all, wasn't blocking a driveway or sitting on public property. It was neatly placed beside the walkway, where it had been for months. But orders were orders, and they had been instructed to remove the violation. The board president stood nearby, arms crossed, smug satisfaction etched across his face. To him, this was victory, a demonstration that no homeowner could stand against the HOA machine. But the homeowner wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. She didn't argue, she didn't beg. Instead, she quietly set up her phone on a tripod at the edge of her yard and hit record. The camera captured everything: the massive bulldozer revving to life, the ridiculous sight of heavy machinery preparing to demolish a ceramic planter, and the growing crowd of stunned neighbors who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The blade lowered. The ground rumbled. And with a single shove, the bulldozer tipped the pot, shattering it into pieces and crushing the flowers into the dirt. The sound was deafening, not because of the machinery, but because of the silence that followed. It was the sound of disbelief, of outrage simmering beneath the surface. The homeowner didn't flinch. She simply walked forward, picked up one broken shard of the painted ceramic, and held it up to the camera. Her eyes burned with quiet fire. In that moment, she knew she had been humiliated publicly, but she also knew she had something far more powerful than the HOA's fines and threats. She had evidence. That night, the video went online. She uploaded it with a simple title: HOA sends a bulldozer for my flower pot. Within hours, it began spreading. Neighbors shared it. Friends shared it. Strangers shook their heads in disbelief and passed it along. By morning, it had gone viral. The HOA thought they had destroyed her defiance. But in reality, they had handed her the perfect weapon. And the war had only just begun. By sunrise, the video was everywhere. What had begun as a simple upload to a social media account snowballed into a storm of outrage and disbelief. The thumbnail alone, an oversized bulldozer looming over a tiny flower pot, was enough to make people click. Within hours, thousands had watched, commented, and shared, each one more incredulous than the last. The captions wrote themselves: HOA gone mad, bulldozer for flowers, and when rules turn to tyranny. Strangers from across the country weighed in. Some laughed at the absurdity, others expressed fury at the abuse of power. Lawyers chimed in, pointing out the overreach of the HOA's authority. Even local news outlets picked up the story, eager to cover the bizarre clash between a homeowner and a board that had clearly lost all sense of reason. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood itself, the tide began to shift. For months, many homeowners had remained silent, too afraid of fines or retaliation. But now, they saw that silence had only emboldened the board. Watching the video gave them courage. They realized that if the HOA could crush flowers with a bulldozer, no one's home was truly safe from their obsession with control. The homeowner, once a quiet figure who had simply wanted a splash of color by her walkway, suddenly found herself at the center of a movement. Her inbox filled with messages of support. Neighbors she barely knew knocked on her door, offering words of encouragement, some even confessing their own horror stories with the HOA. The board president, however, was furious. To him, the video wasn't just embarrassing, it was a threat to his authority. He tried to spin the narrative, calling the homeowner non-compliant and the video misleading. But it was too late. The footage spoke for itself: a massive machine destroying something harmless, petty fines escalating into a spectacle that looked more like tyranny than community leadership. The more he tried to justify the act, the worse it became. Every statement he made was dissected online, mocked, and memed. Screenshots of his condescending HOA letters circulated widely, fueling the fire. What had once been an internal neighborhood dispute had become a national conversation about power, property rights, and the ridiculous extremes of some HOAs. And through it all, the homeowner remained calm. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She simply let the video, and the reaction it stirred, do the work for her. The internet had chosen its side, and it wasn't the HOA's. The days following the viral explosion felt different in the neighborhood. For the first time in years, residents were no longer whispering about the HOA's iron grip, they were openly questioning it. The bulldozer video had shattered the illusion of control, exposing just how absurd and destructive the board's priorities had become. Neighbors who once stayed quiet out of fear began to speak up. Stories poured out like water from a broken dam. One family revealed how they had been fined hundreds of dollars because their blinds were the wrong shade of beige. Another shared how they were forced to tear down a small vegetable garden, even though it was hidden behind there. But she wasn't done. The board had embarrassed her publicly, and now she had the chance to return the favor. She began gathering every letter, every fine, every absurd rule the HOA had ever enforced. If the board wanted a fight, she would give them one, but this time, she would have an army of supporters standing behind her. The battle was no longer just about a flower pot. It was about accountability. It was about standing up to an institution that had gone too far. And as the story spread further, people began to ask, if this could happen in one neighborhood, how many others had faced the same abuse? The homeowner knew she had struck a nerve. What started as a personal fight was quickly transforming into a movement. And the HOA board had no idea how much bigger things were about to get. Fence. Someone else admitted they had been fined for leaving a holiday wreath on their door 1 week too long. Every complaint, once isolated, now found strength in numbers. And all of it pointed back to the same problem, an HOA board that treated its community like subjects instead of neighbors. The homeowner who started it all found herself at the center of the storm. Her house became the unofficial gathering point. People showed up carrying copies of their own violation letters, shaking their heads in disbelief, venting their frustrations. What began as sympathy soon turned into organization. The residents realized they weren't powerless. They had been led to believe the board held absolute authority, but when they reviewed the bylaws together, they discovered something shocking: the power of the board depended entirely on the votes of the community. And if enough people stood up, they could not only challenge the fines, they could remove the board altogether. Word spread fast. Flyers appeared tucked under doors, this time not from the HOA but from the residents themselves. Meetings were held in living rooms and backyards. The video that had embarrassed the neighborhood now became a rallying cry. Meanwhile, the board president fumed. He had expected the video to blow over, for people to move on to the next internet spectacle. Instead, the fire was growing hotter. Reporters began knocking on doors, asking residents for their experiences. Online forums filled with similar horror stories from HOAs across the country. The president, once a man who relished his power, now found himself being painted as the villain of a national headline. But still, he clung to control. Letters continued to be mailed. Threats of more fines were issued. The board even attempted to pass an emergency amendment to restrict public disparagement of HOA authority. But it was too late. Every desperate move only made them look worse, feeding the anger of the neighborhood and fueling the online frenzy. The homeowner, who had once just wanted to keep a flower pot, now saw the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been bullied by rules that made no sense. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also the fire of determination. The revolt was no longer just whispers and complaints. It was action. The residents were preparing to challenge the board formally, to reclaim their neighborhood from the grip of control. And the closer they got to their goal, the more desperate, and dangerous, the HOA leadership became. The showdown was inevitable, the HOA boardroom had never been this crowded. What was usually a dull, half-empty meeting filled with half-hearted nods and rubber stamp approvals was now packed wall to wall with furious residents. Folding chairs lined the hallway. People stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes burning with anger and anticipation. The air was thick with tension, every whisper carrying the same energy: tonight, the board would answer for what they had done. At the head of the room, the board president tried to maintain his composure. He wore the same smug expression he always had, but there was something different this time, a twitch in his jaw, the nervous shuffle of papers he didn't need to shuffle. He knew the neighborhood wasn't here to listen. They were here to fight. The homeowner sat near the front, not to lead, but to stand as proof of what had brought them all here. On the table before her lay the shard of her broken flower pot, a silent reminder of the absurdity that had sparked the revolt. Around her sat families who had suffered years of petty fines, restrictions, and intimidation. This wasn't just one grievance anymore, it was a movement. When the meeting opened, the board attempted to conduct business as usual. Minutes were read, financials glossed over, petty rule amendments presented. But each time they tried to move forward, the crowd pushed. Online frenzy. The homeowner, who had once just wanted to keep a flower pot, now saw the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been bullied by rules that made no sense. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also the fire of determination. The revolt was no longer just whispers and complaints. It was action. The residents were preparing to challenge the board formally, to reclaim their neighborhood from the grip of control. And the closer they got to their goal, the more desperate, and dangerous, the HOA leadership became. The showdown was inevitable, the HOA boardroom had never been this crowded. What was usually a dull, half-empty meeting filled with half-hearted nods and rubber stamp approvals was now packed wall to wall with furious residents. Folding chairs lined the hallway. People stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes burning with anger and anticipation. The air was thick with tension, every whisper carrying the same energy. Tonight, the board would answer for what they had done. At the head of the room, the board president tried to maintain his composure. He wore the same smug expression he always had, but there was something different this time, a twitch in his jaw, the nervous shuffle of papers he didn't need to shuffle. He knew the neighborhood wasn't here to listen. They were here to fight. The homeowner sat near the front, not to lead, but to stand as proof of what had brought them all here. On the table before her lay the shard of her broken flower pot, a silent reminder of the absurdity that had sparked the revolt. Around her sat families who had suffered years of petty fines, restrictions, and intimidation. This wasn't just one grievance anymore, it was a movement. When the meeting opened, the board attempted to conduct business as usual. Minutes were read, financials glossed over, petty rule amendments presented. But each time they tried to move forward, the crowd pushed back. Voices rose, demanding answers, refusing to be silenced by the gavel slamming on the desk. The first spark came when a neighbor stood and read aloud her violation notice, a $200 fine for shade variance, in her curtains. The room erupted in laughter and boos. Another neighbor held up photos of his destroyed vegetable garden, pointing at the board president with shaking hands, his voice trembling with rage. One after another, stories poured out, each more ridiculous than the last, each more damning to the board's credibility. The board president tried to regain control, shouting about order, reminding everyone of the rules, threatening additional fines for disruption of HOA proceedings. But his threats no longer carried weight. The people weren't afraid anymore. The tipping point came when the homeowner finally rose to speak. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rant. She simply held up the video on her phone, playing the moment the bulldozer crushed her flower pot. The room went silent as the familiar roar of machinery filled the air, followed by the crack of ceramic breaking under steel. And then came the collective gasp, the outrage, the disbelief that this had actually happened under their HOA's authority. The president's face turned red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His power was slipping, and he knew it. The residents demanded a vote. Not next month, not in a few weeks, now. A vote to recall the current board and replace them with representatives who would actually listen to the community. The bylaws, which had been carefully studied in living rooms and backyards over the past few weeks, allowed it. And tonight, the residents were ready. The president tried to stall, claiming the meeting wasn't official, that the vote couldn't happen without proper notice. But the crowd was done with excuses. They had the numbers, they had the proof, and they weren't leaving until their voices were heard. And so, the showdown that had been building for weeks reached its peak. Pens scratched across ballots, hands were raised, votes counted one by one. When the results were announced, the room erupted in cheers. The board was dissolved. The president, who had once believed himself untouchable, sat stunned, his power gone in an instant. The homeowner felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew this wasn't the end. Removing the board was victory, yes, but rebuilding trust in the community would take time. Still, for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. The neighborhood felt different in the days after the recall. The suffocating tension that had hung over the community for years was gone, replaced with something lighter, something hopeful. For the first time, residents gathered on their porches without fear of being photographed for violations. Children played in yards without parents worrying about rule enforcement. Even the air itself seemed freer, as though the houses had been waiting for this release all along. The old board president, stripped of his power, disappeared from the spotlight. Rumors swirled that he had sold his house and moved away, unable to endure the humiliation of his downfall. For someone who had thrived on control, the loss of authority was unbearable. His name, once spoken with fear, became nothing more than a cautionary tale. The homeowner, however, found herself in a new role she had never expected. What began as a private battle over a flower pot had grown into something far greater. She wasn't just the woman who stood up to her HOA, she was now a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. And as the crowd filed out into the night, murmuring with hope and excitement, one thing was clear: the HOA's reign of fear was over. But the story wasn't finished. The world was still watching, and the internet still buzzing. What began with a flower pot had turned into a revolution. And soon, the homeowner would realize just how far her fight had reached. Journalists interviewed her. Talk shows invited her to share her story. Online communities rallied behind her, sending thousands of messages of support and solidarity. She accepted the attention with humility, always reminding people that it hadn't been her fight alone. It was the neighborhood's courage, their willingness to stand together, that had truly toppled the board. Still, she carried with her the shard of that broken flower pot, keeping it as a reminder of where it all began. Slowly, the community rebuilt. A new HOA board was formed, not one of power-hungry enforcers, but of neighbors who wanted to preserve fairness while respecting individuality. Rules weren't abandoned, but they were rewritten with compassion and common sense. Instead of fines, the new board focused on dialogue. Instead of threats, they prioritized understanding. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was finally theirs again. The story, however, didn't stop at the subdivision's edge. Across the country, homeowners watched her viral video and felt emboldened to speak up. Online forums filled with people sharing their own HOA horror stories, demanding accountability, organizing recalls, and pushing back against unreasonable restrictions. In a way, the bulldozer hadn't just destroyed a flower pot, it had crushed the illusion that homeowners had to live in fear of their own communities. 1 year later, the homeowner stood in her yard, where a new flower pot rested proudly by her walkway. This one was bigger, brighter, hand-painted once again with bold colors that stood out against the beige monotony. It wasn't just decoration, it was a declaration. A reminder that small acts of individuality mattered, that even the tiniest fight could spark a revolution. As she watered the flowers, neighbors waved as they passed by. Some stopped to chat, their voices warm, no longer laced with the bitterness of fines and threats. Children laughed nearby, chasing each other down the street. The neighborhood